sevens, then either we are in the 70th seven and less than 7 years into it, or we haven't started the 70th seven yet. I'm recording this in June 2013, so if we were in the 70th seven, it would have had to have started no earlier than 2006, 7 years ago. Not just that, but Daniel 9:27 tells us that in the middle of the 70th seven, an end will be put to sacrifice and offering. Remember, Daniel 9 is in the context of the fate of Jerusalem and Daniel's people, the Jews. For the Jewish people, sacrifice and offering can take place only in the temple, and the temple can be only at one specific place, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There has been no temple in Jerusalem since 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and there certainly hasn't been a temple since 2006. Therefore, if the prophecy that an end will be put to sacrifice and offering is to prove true, and the sacrifice and offering is indeed the sacrifice and offering that takes place in the temple, then another temple must first be rebuilt before the final 3.5 years. So, drawing all this to a conclusion, we must be at least 3.5 years away from the everlasting reign of Jesus. Now, let's go back to something I said right at the beginning. Jesus did say it is impossible to predict when he will return. How do we reconcile that with the fact that the angel laid out a timetable for Daniel? Before we can even tackle this question, we have some other questions that we have to answer too. The first and most pressing of these is, what marks the beginning of the 77s? And in chronology, the beginning is known as the epoch. Again, let's look back at Daniel 9. The epoch of the 77s is described in this way: the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. There are various events, all mentioned in the Bible, that could be candidates for this, but the one that fits the best is Nehemiah 2 verses 1 to 8. The decree issued by Artaxerxes authorizing Nehemiah to rebuild the city. And do note that Daniel 9 specifically refers to Jerusalem, not to the temple. Dating this decree to the first of the Jewish month of Nisan 445 BC is consistent with both the Bible and secular historians. And according to astronomers, the first of Nisan 445 BC would be the 14th of March 445 BC in our modern calendar. So let's deal first with the initial 69 sevens of the 70. Again, going on our assumption that this represents 69 7-year periods, and that each year is 360 days, the time period in question would be 69 times 7 times 360 days, which is 173,880 days. We can convert this into modern years by dividing by 365.242. Remember that leap years occur every 4 years, but do not occur on the century except every 4th century, so it's not exactly 365.25. In modern years, then, the first 69 weeks, or sevens, equate to approximately 476.0679 years, and if you convert that into years and days, it would be 476 years and 25 days. This is an approximation. The more exact method to find the end point of the 69 sevens takes the 173,880 days and counts forward this number of days from 14th of March 445 BC. I can do that calculation indirectly in Microsoft Excel. Excel does not allow dates before 1900, but instead of 445 BC, I can start with, say, 14th of March 1956 AD. If I add 173,880 days to this date, I get April 7th, 2432. But I have to make one adjustment. I also need to subtract 1 day because Jewish practice counted inclusively at both ends. So from 14th of March to 15th of March, for example, would be 2 days, not 1 day. And my end result then is April 6th, 2432. Sure enough, this is 476 years and 24 days later than my start point. And I had 476 years 25 days before, and there's a day difference there because of the approximation in my earlier estimate. Now, because I used 1956 AD and not 445 BC, and because 1956 is 2400 years later than 445 BC, you've got to remember here there is no 0 AD or 0 BC, my final step to find the endpoint of the 69 sevens is to subtract 2400 years from April 6th, 2432, which brings me to April 6th, 2032 AD. Now I convert this back to the Jewish calendar, and I'd find that this date is the 10th of Nisan, 32 AD. We can deduce from John 11:55 and John 12:1 that this was the actual date Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And how does Daniel 9 describe the endpoint of the 69 sevens? When the Anointed One, the ruler, comes. And note here, the Hebrew for Anointed One is Messiah. This is either an incredible coincidence, or it points to how prophetically accurate the prophecy given by the angel to Daniel was. I also think it's strong vindication of our earlier assumption that the sevens are in fact groups of 7 years. The angel predicted with incredible accuracy when Jesus would first come. So again, how do we square this with Jesus' warning that no one except God knows the hour of his coming? Well, first, of course, when Jesus warned this, he was talking about his second coming, not his first coming. But maybe you've spotted a bigger problem here. You may be asking, if the 77 started in 445 BC, and the first 69 of those sevens ended in 32 AD, shouldn't the 70th seven have ended sometime in 39 AD? And now we're almost 2,000 years later than that. That is a great question, and I'm going to suggest an explanation that may seem like hand-waving at first, but which I believe stands up to scrutiny by anyone who's open to everything the Bible has to say. The explanation is that there is an intervening period of time of indefinite length between 1 to 69 and 70. First, look back at the passage from Daniel 9, and I think you'll have to agree that nothing in this passage absolutely excludes the possibility, even if at first you may find it not very credible. But aside from the fact that the events of the 70th week have clearly not yet been fulfilled, there are two reasons to suppose an intervening period. Number one is that there is precedent for this in the Old Testament, and number two is that it's consistent with the way the New Testament talks about the age of the church, the time that we're now in, broadly speaking, between Jesus' crucifixion and his return. So first, the precedent. In the book of Kings, it's said that Solomon began to build the temple 480 years after Israel came out of Egypt. But in Acts, Paul gives a chronology that adds up to 573 years between the Exodus and the building of the temple. 40 years in the wilderness, 450 years under the judges, 40 years of David's reign, and then the first 3 years of Solomon's reign, for a total of 573. So 480, 573. What about this apparent self-contradiction of the Bible? If we read the book of Judges, we find that God sold Israel into the hands of their enemies a number of times. 8 years to the king of Mesopotamia, 18 to the king of Moab, 20 to the king of Canaan, 7 to the Midianites, and 40 to the Philistines. So if you add these years when Israel did not enjoy sovereignty together, you'll get a result of 93 years. Subtract that 93 from Paul's 573 years, and the result is 480 years. So what we've done here is we've reconciled the 573 years of Acts with the 480 years of Kings. The point of all this is that not only is a year in prophecy to be understood very specifically as a 360-day period, in the context of Israel's history, it's also to be understood as a time when Israel is in a right relationship with God, and that also correlates with when the Jewish people are sovereign in the land of Israel. Now you might ask, haven't the Jewish people been sovereign in the land of Israel since 1948 in recent times? Well, maybe we should be even more specific here about sovereignty and speculate that prophetically the sovereignty cannot be considered to be complete without a functioning Jewish temple. Though Jerusalem was recaptured by Israel in 1967 in the Six-Day War, to this date there is no Jewish temple on the Temple Mount because the Islamic Dome of the Rock stands in its place. So precedent makes it reasonable to suppose that the 77s in total may have intervening periods of time which don't count. And this would also in particular make sense at the division points of the 77s, so for example after the first 69. I talked about one reason, the precedent. The second reason to suppose that the time of the Church in particular is an intervening time comes from the way the New Testament talks about this time. We don't have time to read all of Romans 11, but I highly recommend that you do so yourself because it sheds a lot of light on how God views the intervening church period. But here's just one excerpt. Israel's hardening in part since Jesus' time, the one that still exists today, is similar in kind to the times of disobedience during the ancient times of the judges. What it doesn't mean, as some in the church have unfortunately and erroneously taught, is that the church has replaced Israel as God's chosen people. If you say this, it's exactly the same kind of conceitedness that Romans 11 seems to warn us against. Romans 11 is consistent with Daniel 7, that the deliverer, that's Jesus, will turn godlessness away from Jacob, which sounds to me very like establishing everlasting righteousness. But again, this is in the future. In the meantime, Israel's hardening in part is for our benefit as Gentiles, that the full number of the Gentiles may come in, and what this means is that the number of Gentiles that God has predetermined should be admitted to the ranks of his people will be admitted. So, not only does precedent make it reasonable to suppose that there's an intervening period between the 69th and 70th sevens, but even if we don't know how long that period will be, we do know that it's not random. It does have a specific purpose, and that once that specific number of Gentiles has been reached, it can come to an end. So let's summarize all this by putting the pieces together in chronological order. The 77s revealed by an angel to Daniel started on the 14th of March 445 BC, close enough to a century after Daniel's lifetime. The event that started it was the decree by Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. The sevens, a period of exactly 7 years, and each year in turn is a period of exactly 360 days, consistent with the Jewish and other ancient calendars. Therefore we count 69 sevens, or 173,880 days, from 14th of March 445 BC to reach the 6th of April 32 AD, when Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, fulfilling the prophecy in Daniel of the coming of Messiah the Prince. But Jesus was rejected as Messiah by his own people, the Jews, and in the words of Daniel 9, was cut off, that is, put to death. So started the indeterminate age of the Church, which holds back the beginning of the 70th seven. I believe Jesus will gather believers in his church to him, as described in 1 Thessalonians 4:15-17, right around the beginning of the 70th week. And it is this event that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24 when he said of it that no one knows that day or hour. It could be any time, and you need to be ready for it by repenting and following Jesus. After the age of the church begins the 70th seven, which according to Daniel 9 is divided into two halves. During the first half of the 70th seven, I think we can expect to see a new Jewish temple in Jerusalem, complete with sacrifices and offerings. Exactly halfway, or 1,260 days through the seven, the sacrifices will be stopped, and the second half of the 7-year period, the remaining 1,260 days, will be a time of great evil as described in Revelation 13. But it does come to an end with the return of Jesus for an everlasting reign of righteousness. This sounds a little bit like heaven, but reading carefully, I think instead Jesus starts his everlasting reign on earth, with heaven described a little bit later on in Revelation. That again is a subject for another time.